I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, a trip made by Jewish leaders to Turkey, Egypt, and Israel, coordinated by the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, the umbrella group that represents more than 50 of the leading Jewish organizations in the United States. And one of those on that trip is a gentleman who's become a real fan favorite here on JBS, the director of the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society at NYU Law School, where he is a distinguished fellow, as well as the award-winning novelist, essayist, and analyst of contemporary Jewish life, Thane Rosenbaum, who joins us now on our JBS phones. Thane, thank you so much for giving us some time.
Sorry I couldn't be sitting beside you, Mark. You know, it's my favorite seat.
Yes, I do. My favorite seat is right next to yours as well. So, Thane, what was the trip like for you?
Well, I was, the one, I would say, interloper, Frank. Well, that's not true. Michael Mukasey, the former United States Attorney General, and I were probably I think we were the only two people of the 50 or so Jewish leaders who had no portfolio, no institutional affiliation. We were the free agents, so to speak.
Thane, how did you happen to go on the trip?
Malcolm invited me. He called me up very graciously. He obviously watches JBS TV. And I must say, Mark, you should know, and your viewers should know, that many people on this trip knew me from JBS TV. They may have read me at some point, but people are watching, Mark. It's important to know. People of significance and good intention in the Jewish world watch your show regularly.
That is lovely.
I was invited, and I was happy to have been invited.
Okay, and again, you're talking about Malcolm Hoenlein, who is Executive Vice Chairman.
Is the Executive Vice Chairman of the President's Conference of Major Jewish Organizations.
Okay.
It's like an all-star team.
Okay, so you were one of the interlopers. What was it like for you?
Well, it was fascinating. As you know, I'm always involved in the Jewish world, but really from a distance as a writer and thinker and author and professor. But I really, I've always I do it as a free agent, so to speak. Although I think you and I know that I do have an interest of one day perhaps being much more officially, formally involved institutionally in the Jewish world.
Yes.
So this was my first time watching Jewish leaders engage in their own back-channeled diplomatic efforts, because that's what this was. It was stunning access that the Jewish community receives through Malcolm Hoenlein's group. It really was stunning. Imagine, Mark, and your listeners, if a similar group was sent of leaders of some ethnic, religious group from another country, and in a 4-day period, they met with the President of the United States, the majority leader of the Senate, the majority leader of the House, the minority leader of the House and the Senate, the Speaker of the House, the head of the FBI, the head of the CIA. It was that, essentially.
That's amazing.
If they were given briefings by the head of the Air Force, the head of the IDF, the head of, in this case, Israel's national police force, in a very short time. There was no time to go to the shuk to buy dates or fruit.
All right,
it was just Malcolm Hoenlein had it running on around the clock from davening in the morning at 6:15 to 11 o'clock at night.
Fabulous.
So for me, it was. I think for others, they expect that kind of access. We on opening night, Prime Minister Netanyahu addressed the group at a dinner. That was the first thing right out of the box.
How many people
and
were...
one of the last things we did is we went to the home of President Rivlin at his actual home of the presidency and saw the beautiful sculpture garden with the busts, sculptures of all the other previous presidents of Israel. It's still a young country. There are not that many former presidents, where he spoke and welcomed, again, the group. So, again, the amount of access that Hoenlein received was stunning. There wasn't anybody of significance in the entire country of Israel who didn't visit us or we didn't go visit, including a visit to the Golan Heights, we all packed in a bus and went to the Golan Heights, where the brigadier general in charge of the Golan handed us binoculars and pointed out the various villages and what their associations were. This was Druze Arabs, this is ISIS, this is Syrian, rebels, these are Alawites. And, to see really, Israel's vulnerability without the Golan.
All right, let me take it a few steps at a time. Am I correct? You visited Turkey and met with President Erdogan.
Yeah, I wasn't part of that trip. They did. About a third of our group. I wish I had gone. A third of the group, a much smaller number, started with Erdogan and Sisi. So we joined them, most of the rest joined them in Jerusalem for what it was the real conference.
I understand.
The others were just these visits, which were astonishing. And I had been briefed on it, although, frankly, as I told you, much of this is off the record, many of the briefings. We were told, however, or I think Malcolm Hoenlein was told by Prime Minister Netanyahu, that the most significant thing that the Israelis saw in these visits, because, this is a delegation of American Jews who went to see the head of the Turkish government and the head of the Egyptian government, knowing full well that these, at different points in Israel history, had been great enemies of the Jewish state.
Yes.
And now there is great, of course, warmth and friendship between the Egyptians and the Israelis, at least the governments. And Erdogan, there is a kind of rapprochement, a revival of relations, certainly in defensive and military cooperation, but that they received and in each instance met, I think, for 2 hours with these leaders. Mm-hmm. Think about it. This is not a perfunctory photo op, right?
Right.
These were serious discussions. Prime Minister Netanyahu apparently told Malcolm Hoenlein that from his perspective, the most significant effect was that the very next day, the Egyptian newspapers on the front page had photos of the meeting. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to think about why that's significant, because, the Arab world, as you know, does not have a free press, and they don't get to see things. I learned for the first time, Mark, you may already know this, that the Egyptian school books, history books, only recently acknowledge that there's a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt.
Interesting.
They didn't know, the kids growing up in Egypt until this year, I guess this is Sisi's work, even during the friendship years of Mubarak, the thinking was that the Arab street should always believe that their enemy is Israel, even if their enemy is not Israel. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We think of the Saudi Arabian course books that speak of Jews as pigs and monkeys, right? But even a more subtle, non-disclosure was in Egypt for all of these years after Begin Sadat's historic peace treaty, and after decades of actual peace between those two nations.
Amazing.
The people didn't know.
Yes. Okay, so here you are in Israel. You're going on all of these fabulous trips. You're meeting with everyone. Thane, you have a very good sense of Israel and the issues that drive the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the issues that drive Israeli life in general. Do you feel you learned anything really new by the meetings you had and the places you saw? How were your own eyes opened, Thane?
An excellent question. Well, Mark, you may remember that you and I spent a lot of time sitting next to each other on camera discussing the Iran nuclear deal. Yes. And we remembered that Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke to Congress and then to the Jewish community, and then President Obama spoke to the Jewish community. The Israelis, from my understanding of this past week, look, they know it's a bad deal, but they don't worry about it the way we did. They just believe they'll handle it. They think it's a terrible deal, but they have to get to the next level. nor do they think that the Iranians are capable of abiding by the agreement. They don't know. None of the political leaders for every party, and again, we heard from Bougie Herzog and Yair Lapid, and of course Netanyahu. I mean, we heard from everybody, and nobody believes for a minute. We heard from the mayor of Jerusalem. But nobody believes that they'll abide by it. In fact, they already know that there's been violations of it, certainly with respect to the inspections. One of those loopholes that you and I discussed so much actually appeared, where I forgot the name of the nuclear facility. When the inspectors came, they were denied all access under a loophole in the agreement which says that no access will be given to any installation that might have a military purpose.
Yes.
And it was left to the Iranians to decide which ones had nuclear purposes. And I suspect you and I will guess that every single one will have had a military purpose. So the inspectors will never actually walk in the door of any of these facilities. So they were standing outside the door, and at some point someone came out and gave them an oral report of what was in there. And that was it. That's the nuclear deal that President Obama and John Kerry told us was the best they could get.
Yes.
So we know that has already happened. The Israelis predicted it, and it happened. We already know that there's been 2 tests of missiles that violate at least the UN's nuclear proliferation agreement, which Iran is a signatory. So there's already violations on that agreement, which has been violated repeatedly. But the Israelis, if you talk to the leaders, they're more concerned right now of Iran's ongoing sponsorship of neighbors closer to us, specifically Hezbollah, which they see, to the Israelis, they see Hezbollah in ways that they don't regard Hamas, which is that they're sitting on much more sophisticated weaponry that is capable of hitting Eilat, the southernmost major city in Israel.
Yeah. Thane, you were in Jerusalem. What do you feel the mood of the city was? Did you have any time to just, soak in the atmosphere? Can you give us a sense of how Israelis are day to day? You and I have spoken on JBS, off JBS, about the wave of knifings and gun shootings and cars running over people, and the extent to which it is almost a mini intifada. What's the mood in Jerusalem when you were there?
Well, the first thing, Mark, which is the best anecdote I can supply, is on the first full day that I was there, I was looking at the schedule and realized there was really no time for me to do things like, for instance, go into Jerusalem and buy gifts for my kids. And I thought, wow, it'd be really great if I could break away right now, but I couldn't. And I remembered when I was thinking of that, it was in the morning of that first day. And an hour later on Jerusalem Post online, it listed that there was a thwarted knifing attack where the Palestinian terrorist was shot dead right outside Damascus Gate in the Old City. Mm-hmm. And I know for a fact that's where I would have gone. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's where I was going. There's no doubt. I was only up the hill off Jabotinsky Street. I would have climbed up the hill, and I would have been just about 12 minutes away. That's it. And I could have been one of those attacked, or I could have witnessed the Palestinian terrorists being shot, or watched the aftermath. This is their lives. When the head of the Israeli police department, it's hard to believe that Israel, the police department, it's a small country, is a national position. It's not a citywide position. Came to speak to us. He pointed out, I forgot what the numbers are. I think there are 30 Israelis that have been killed in this third intifada, and I think some outrageous 800 injured. We're forgetting that the numbers are serious. I think the average now is something like 2 attacks a day. That's the average. So it's not even that you could say it's only once a week. It could happen 14 times a week. Mm-hmm. So going outside in Israel, certainly in any major part of Jerusalem, is a risk. On the other hand, as you know, The spirit of the Israelis is always, indefatigable, always resolute, and there was no evidence at all of a people in crisis. Mm-hmm. It's just the way they live. I can't imagine New Yorkers responding that way, but it's just the way they live. I did not see anyone not going shopping because they knew there were knifing attacks in their community. There was no evidence. I've been to Israel many times, and it was not as if you saw less foot traffic.
I understand. Now, you describe how various leaders, political and otherwise, address the group. What should we imagine? How many people are in this group, and what's the setting? Are you in an auditorium? Are you sitting around a table? What's the setting?
It's small rooms of a hotel, usually, smaller rooms, and around 50 people, give or take, between, I think, 50 and 75. I'm pretty sure that was the number. In some instances, I think there were some spouses that were there. So I can't say that the entire number were made up of Jewish leaders. There were some that were just spouses. So it's hard to know the exact number, but I would say about 50 in a smaller rooms of a hotel ballroom, small rooms. Usually around meals in between. There were some panel discussions as well. A very active question and answer period, Mark, as you would not be surprised to hear that. Your buddy Mort Klein was very very present. Mort doesn't for the people who are fans of ZOA, they should know that their leader doesn't cut anybody a break. He's the first guy up.
By the way,
there was one attempt to sort of speak about the members of Knesset who are a part of the Arab parties who went to visit the families of terrorists who were shot in the act of terrorizing Israelis. And, Mort took a very strong position that these people should be thrown out of the Knesset. This is an act of treason. Mm-hmm. And this question came up repeatedly. Mm-hmm. What should be done with the MKs who are Arabs who have been supporting terrorism?
Very interesting.
There's ongoing, issues of moral equivalence, right? That the acts of terror of knife-wielding Palestinians is merely a response to the, quote, occupation, close quote, and that everybody, therefore, is a fair game, women, children, which, obviously any fair-minded person knows is outrageous. But it was intimate, to answer your question. It was intimate. They spoke often off the record because they thought they were speaking to people they could trust, which they could. They didn't hold back their feelings, even when, as you know, Israelis often disagree, so we heard those disagreements. There was a lot of, give and take. And by the way, Mark, there was some variation even in the group that came. Not everyone was right of center. There were some left of center. Mm-hmm. There were some groups that had the word labor in their title. Mm-hmm. So there, we know what their leanings were. Mm-hmm. But it was, very thoughtful in every way, incredibly informative, respectful. But I must say, inspiring, because once again, you see, we were assured by the head of the Air Force, the head of the IDF, that Israel is safe and that it takes every single precaution, that everyone is doing their job to keep their country safe, and that we shouldn't be worried about them.
Very interesting.
There are obviously conflicts, great conflicts, but the Israelis know how to handle it.
Thane, I want to come back to a point you made a moment ago, and I want you to address it for the audience. There are some people who are critical of the President's Conference because they feel it is too much establishment. And by establishment, they also mean today leaning to the right. And that obviously Mort Klein is far to the right, but there is right of center and left of center, and there's a feeling among many in the Jewish world that the Conference of Presidents is right of center. And one of the things I was curious to hear you talk about was the extent to which you felt Malcolm and the conference provided the group with opportunities to hear from those on the Israeli left, as opposed to those right and center. So speak to that for a moment. To what extent, was the Israeli left really also given a chance to speak to your group?
Well, Bougie Herzog, among other things, pointed out his ongoing policy proposals on a unilateral withdrawal from the West Bank, a true sense, a divorce, a separation, very much like Gaza. To many people in the President's Conference, nobody wants a repeat of Gaza. That's not a good model. On the other hand, the thought was Herzog's to say, look, let's just, protect the two large settlements. We'll make sure that there's sufficient protection for the two major settlements in the West Bank. And let's separate, and this way, we will largely avoid the knifing attacks, among other things. But, most people in the President's Conference would have disagreed. But we heard it. There were a number of people who came to speak to us, whether they were members of the Knesset or people who were involved in policy think tanks. We heard from a number of those, who were critical of the government's mishandling of these peace discussions. Most people in the group were supportive of Netanyahu. He received several rousing standing ovations from this group. So, yes, there isn't any question that the President's Conference is right of center. It is also true that Malcolm provided alternative voices throughout the entire week. And again, when that happened, you heard, Mort Klein and others challenging these presumptions of more leftist thinking. But it was out there, it was out there for consumption and for hearing. Look, these are very troubling times, and the issues are not simple. You heard repeatedly, that nobody wants Israel to not be a democratic country in which the majority of people are not receiving the same levels of legal rights, and that it can preserve itself as a Jewish state, but not as a functioning democracy.
Yes.
And you heard a number of people being critical of the double standard of legal treatment between Jews and Palestinians.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Did anything you either heard or saw or experienced in Israel bother you or upset you? And, you occupy now a very unique place in the Jewish world. You obviously have leaned liberal your entire career. At the same time, you're remarkably pro-Israel, and you tend to see things from an objective perspective. From your objective perspective, left or right, did anything upset you about what you learned or saw on this trip to Israel?
Well, the most upsetting discussion we had was with the press. The person who's the head of the office of the Associated Press, the AP, and some of the others. There was a discussion moderated by David Horowitz, the head of the Times of Israel. It was a moderated discussion. I will say he was very effective in making it challenging. But, we heard some outrageous, a lot of people, of course, were critical of the coverage of the New York Times. They were not represented, although I think they were invited to speak. They declined, I think. But the others, for the most part, Peter Lerner, who, as many people remember, is the spokesperson for the IDF. He was there. But the others on the panel, maintain that they're pro-Israel, which was so laughable, given the fact that they don't even refer to terrorists as terrorists. Mm-hmm. And given the fact that they don't think that it's an act of terrorism if the actions are taken, anywhere within the West Bank. That's just armed resistance. I think they even believe that when it comes to Jerusalem, for the most part. Mm-hmm. So it was very, again, discouraging. It's not like I didn't know. I'm a writer myself, but it was discouraging how smug you hear those people whose job it is to report the truth, how smug they are and casual they are about the way they don't report the truth.
Interesting.
And it just was very difficult to watch because you see that this is going to be, an immutable, implacable problem. Israel is never going to receive favorable press, maybe not in our lifetime,
Yes.
just not.
Thane, was there any reference to what we see now going on with the American elections, the primaries, both Democrat and Republican, any discussion of Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump?
No, other than a number of people made jokes about Donald Trump. So he's funny in every country, I guess. In any language, Trump is funny. No, I mean, we did not hear from anybody who they would have wanted to see as the next president of the United States. No one entered into that discussion.
Okay, and I'm also referring to simply informal discussions you had with people who were on the trip with you.
Oh, well, the interesting thing is that because they're right of center, there was far more talks about the possibility of a Republican president. So as you and I know, 80% of American Jews lean Democrat. I'm not sure that's true at the president's conference. Nobody took a poll, but my guess is that that number is not true. Mm-hmm. It's either 50% or higher who would be voting in the primaries for a Republican candidate.
Thane Rosenbaum, it is always wonderful to talk to you. Again, I want you sitting next to me as soon as possible, but I'm very glad you had a chance to come on and just sort of give us an overview of this very interesting trip. The President's Conference goes once a year, and as you hear, this was Thane's first visit. But I appreciate the time, Thane. I look forward to seeing you very, very soon.
Anything for you and JBS TV, Mark. You must know that by now.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. The thoughts of Thane Rosenbaum, novelist and director of the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society at NYU Law School, where he is a distinguished fellow. My thanks, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, the associate director of JBS, Dara Golub, and to the producers of this edition of In the News, Carol Lilienthal and Jan Weiss. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.